Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. Up first, excerpts from the latest BCI Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University. K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larsen, K-State cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, and K-State agricultural economist Dustin Pendell cover several topics, including bringing new cattle into the herd. Agricultural law professor Roger McEowen discusses a recent blog that asks, can foreign persons or entities own U.S. agricultural land? Also a save-the-date reminder for a weed management field day coming up in Hayes. And Gus Vanderhoeven has this week's Stop, Look, and Listen. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online.
This is Agriculture Today. The latest BCI Cattle Chat podcast is out from a team of researchers at the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University. K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larsen, K-State cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, and K-State agricultural economist Dustin Pendell cover a variety of topics this week, starting with a question that they received that Brad first addresses to Bob about bringing on new cattle to a closed herd.
And I'm going to think, just from reading the question, that we're really talking more about either open heifers or pregnant heifers. What do you do? How do you manage that?
And the situation might be, there are some producers that don't raise their own replacement heifers, and so they routinely bring in replacement either pregnant or bred heifers or cows. Other farms typically raise their own replacements, but for some reason this year I need more. So
let me ask you a question real quick. How many replacements do we normally keep?
Well, the national average, according to the NOMS survey, was around 15%. But again, averages can be somewhat deceptive. I think probably a good number is a lot of herds are going to be in that 10% range, and some herds are going to be quite a bit higher. They're not going to get much below 10% replacement because, you're talking about 5 to 10% of the cows either are open or lose a calf, and so probably in that 10 to 15 range.
So any differences in disease risk if I bring in, and knowing it might be different times of year, but if I bring in an open heifer versus a pregnant heifer, same disease risk, any differences?
There's a little bit of difference because there's two ways to look at it. One is there's actually 4 animals that I'm worried about. I'm worried about the female that I bring in, that's 1, the calf that's inside her, that's 2, the cows I already own, that's 3, and the calves inside the cows I already own is 4. And so there's up to 4 animals impacted from a health standpoint when I bring in new animals. So one way to look at it is the least risk I have is when there's only 2 animals to worry about. In other words, my cows aren't pregnant yet, and I bring in non-pregnant heifers or cows. That gives me the least risk from a just flat number of cows at risk. And so my preference is, if I could, I would bring in open animals before my cows are bred. That would be ideal, but that's a pretty short time window, so it's not always easy to hit that, but that would be my ideal.
And Bob, I want to ask you, so when you bring on new animals, or your recommendation working with these cow-calf operations, do you keep them separate from the rest of the herd, and how long do we want to keep them separate?
Yeah, great question. And I think my typical advice is yes, do some kind of quarantine behavior, and a lot of times that'll mean just putting that group off in a pasture separated from other cows. And I like a 30 to 45 day kind of quarantine window just to make sure everything's okay. The other bit is sort of alignment of vaccination schedules and strategies. So
during that 30 to 45 days, you can get your vaccine, both your base herd, your home herd, and the new animals coming in, make sure they're getting the same.
And I think, Bob, your point of the risk of, it's not just what the new ones might bring, it's what we might have that the ones we brought in are naive to.
I think that is an often forgotten point.
Because we think we're clean and perfect.
And actually, as a veterinarian, I've probably been at least as many times I've been called in when the animals brought in started aborting versus the base herd aborting because of what I brought in. And so that, and again, a lot of times we assume, because our herd has kind of gotten some stability and it's got good immunity, and there are some circulating viruses and bacteria in our herd, but that's pretty stable. And then when you bring in naive animals, they could show much more serious responses than our base herd, our home herd.
So I want to go back to I like the 30 to 45 days, keeping them separate, because a lot of the things that we're concerned about are transient infections. So if we have a virus or a bacteria that's causing illness, then in that 30 to 45 day window, if I see no sickness, I've passed through a lot of those. So I think that's a great point. There is an exception to that, and it's the one you were talking about with the pregnant heifers that they could bring in. You were talking a little about that?
It's the difference. There's a lot of the viruses that we're talking about are temporary. So it's kind of like the human cold. I have it for a while and then I get rid of it. But there are some infections that are persistent infections, and probably the one that's most important to us from a reproductive standpoint is BVD, or bovine viral diarrhea. And that's one that basically there are a few animals that are persistently infected, basically lifelong infection. So 30 or 45 days is not long enough because they can carry that for their entire life. Younger animals are more likely to be persistently infected than older animals, and it's because that's a fairly serious health concern to be a persistently infected BVD animal, and so you're likely to die. The older you are, the more likely you don't have it because you would have died by now. And so when we bring in young animals, and that could be either the calf that's inside a replacement animal or a newly born calf, would be my highest risk animals for being a persistently infected BVD calf. But the adults could be. It's not very common, but they could be.
So what we'll do, and I think those are good points, you have to have a strategy, and in our Cattle Chat checklist, we're going to talk about the top tips for bringing in replacement females to manage the health side.
One is to make sure that they're a match with the herd, and that a lot of times that has to do with the geography. So if I'm moving animals from very cold environments to very hot, or vice versa, or moving animals that are not used to fescue to pastures that have fescue on it, I don't want to necessarily do those things. So make sure that they're a good match for the herd.
Number 8 is make sure that I've got all the paperwork in order. So both if I'm getting them from interstate, an interstate health certificate, and follow any other import regulations related to my state.
Number 7, know the health status of the source herd. So if you're going to bring calves from an auction barn versus maybe a private treaty.
Make sure the home herd or your base cow herd's well vaccinated. So I think sometimes we get real focused on the animals that are coming in and don't think about, our cows well vaccinated for that sort of inbound disease risk, and making sure that they're not exposing the imported ones to something that they're not ready for. So
Number 5 is avoid high-risk times, and a lot of times that's going to be a little bit dependent on the disease, but early in pregnancy, the first half of pregnancy or so, and some diseases it's during the breeding season.
Number 4, if I don't know the history, or even if I do, make sure I have a good vaccination strategy on the incoming cattle.
Number 3, diagnostic tests. Make sure you have a strategy. Work with your veterinarian to develop a strategy.
Number 2, quarantine. So if you routinely, even if you don't routinely import cattle, females into your herd, have a plan for a place to put them so they're not nose to nose with your existing cow herd or replacement female. So kind of put them off in some space, 30 to 45 days, and kind of observe and make sure that they're getting through that transition okay. Probably observe health on those animals daily or every other day. Just kind of keep tabs on them, what's happening.
And number 1 builds off that one, and we want to observe both the current and the incoming cattle. Even the best laid plans, we want to make sure that they're working as we expect them to be. So those are our top 9 Cattle Chat checklist items for importing females to try to manage health problems. Dustin, we talked about risk management last week and lots of different types of risk. We talked about financial risk. We talked about some of the price risk. We talked about some other areas. We wanted to focus today on production risk. Tell us a little bit about production risk and how we can manage it.
Yep. So last time we did talk about those types of risk, including also human resource and labor, I think we called it, and legal risk. But today we're going to talk about production risk. Production risk, all we're talking about there is if you're anything related to the quality and or quantity of production. And the sources could be weather, diseases, predators, technologies, etc. And so there are some different ways to try to sources to reduce risk. Could be enterprise diversification would be an example, I guess. So for me, it's easy to think in the crop side, you plant different varieties of crops or different kinds of crops. I guess on the livestock side, maybe you bring in different types of livestock. Now, if you do diversify, I think you also run some risk of, right, you're specialized, and so you get some efficiencies and this and that. But then when diversifying, you might lose some of those gains from specialization.
Because actually another way to control production risk is just to gain expertise, to kind of know all the risks and manage around them. And the more enterprises I have, the harder it is to be an expert on a lot of things.
Well, that's exactly it. If you do decide to diversify, now all of a sudden, if I'm going to grow various crops, I need to know how to produce those. Do I need additional labor, et cetera? So there are other risks that you might jump into in that case. Some other kinds of things, thinking about production risk, ways to reduce it, maybe through contract production. I think it's probably more common in poultry and swine, but I suppose a producer could participate in some kind of brand program.
Or even sometimes I was speaking to a veterinarian and producer that does heifer development. So they've got a structured business where, so the selling price of the animals, and even so the selling price of bred replacement heifers is kind of already set, and then they also offer to buy back heifers out of those pregnancies at a set price, and it's like 5 cents above market or whatever. And so again, trying to have some risk management in both, and again, it overlaps between price risk protection and production risk protection that kind of overlap on some of those.
We've also talked about feed supplements, maybe improved feed supplements, better genetics, maybe is another example, technologies. Maybe one other final way to try to reduce risk, the production risk, would be some kind of lease arrangement.
Yeah, and I think that's an option. And exploring those different options, it's one of the things, and as we talked about last time, and we'll continue this risk management series because it's easy to put off that thought process because we're busy doing the day-to-day stuff. We're thinking about how we get the cows fed. Do we need to move them to this pasture or that pasture? But it's important to have a strategy for risk management. We address production risk this week. Next week, we're going to talk about...
we can do financial risk.
Financial risk. So we'll talk about financial risk next week.
That's Brad White, Bob Larsen, Bob Weaber, and Dustin Pendell of the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University. To subscribe to the Cattle Chat podcast, visit ksubci.org. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Time again to check in with agricultural law professor Roger McEowen of Washburn University. This time he discusses a recent blog that asks the question, can foreign persons or entities own U.S. agricultural land? Roger, a chance to talk about whether or not foreign persons and entities owning U.S. agricultural land maybe is a good idea. Is that kind of where we're headed with this?
Well, we've had restrictions in this country basically ever since our founding, and that's a carryover from English common law, but it raises a concern. That's the reason we have these restrictions. It's basically a national security issue. What the concern is that we would have potentially disloyal parties owning U.S. real estate food base, and that wouldn't be a good thing. As of the end of 2016, the USDA reported that foreign individuals and entities held interests in just shy of 30 million acres. It was 28.3 million acres of U.S. ag land. That's about 2.2% of all the privately held land, ag land in the United States, about 1% of all U.S. land. And so that has raised questions in recent years and in recent months about whether there are laws on the books that might protect American soil from being owned by foreign persons and interests. So we've heard a lot about Chinese investors over the years, other countries, other individuals from foreign countries owning land, and that has raised a lot of questions that I've gotten in recent months, and that's the reason of a recent blog post on the topic.
A lot of the purchasing started in about 2008, but there was some issues back in the 1970s as well?
Yeah, there sure was. In fact, that generated a round of congressional reaction to that at that time. And it was in 1978 that the Congress enacted what's known as the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act. And basically what we have at the federal law is a reporting requirement. So the USDA, under that law, gathers information on U.S. ag holdings of foreign individuals and businesses. And it's basically a reporting statute. It's not a regulatory statute. It's a reporting statute that gives the federal government information in these reports that might serve as the basis for any future action that Congress might take if they think that there is too much agricultural land being held by foreign individuals and entities. But it's really not any type of a regulatory law at the federal level.
And they're requiring them to report on 4 different situations or scenarios?
Yeah, that's what the federal law does. The law requires reports when a foreign person acquires or transfers any interest other than a security in ag land, or when any interest in ag land except the security interest is held by a foreign person, or when a non-foreign owner of ag land subsequently becomes a foreign person, as well as when non-ag land owned by a foreign person subsequently becomes ag land. If you trip any of those 4 requirements, then there's a reporting to the federal government that has to be made.
I guess one thing they did do was they did define agricultural land for this.
Yeah, it's any land located in any of the states that's used for agricultural, forestry, or timber production purposes. So we tend to think of it in the Midwest and in the plains as cropland or pasture land, range land, but it's broader than that. Agriculture for this purpose is going to cover forestry, it's going to cover timber production. That's deemed to be agricultural land for purposes of the reporting requirement at the federal level.
I guess there are some federal restrictions, but a lot of this, according to your blog, is boiling down to how the states react or enforce their own laws. Yeah,
that's right. The federal law, as I said, is just a reporting statute. The real teeth, if there is much teeth at all in terms of a regulatory type system, is at the state level. And so the state laws are basically of 3 types. Some states have outright restrictions on the acquisition of certain types of property. Other states will limit the total amount of land that can be acquired, and still other states will put limits on the length of time that property can be held. And these restrictions are fairly common in the agricultural context in terms of barring acquisition of land by foreign individuals and entities. And where there are major restrictions, it tends to be right in the center of the country. So if you look primarily at Iowa, Iowa has the most restrictive limitation on non-resident alien ownership of any state. Minnesota, also Missouri, those states have the predominant type restrictions, the most restrictive statutes anywhere. You've got roughly half the states that have some sort of restriction. Now, many of them are minor, but about half the states do restrict, in one way or another, foreign ownership or acquisition of agricultural land.
So is it concerning then that only roughly slightly more than half of our states do have any kind of restrictions?
Well, of course, it's a policy decision at the state level, and the legislatures in those states that do have the restrictions have felt that, from a policy reason, that they wanted some type of restriction. Now, it may just be a reporting requirement at the state level. It may, when you get into Iowa, it may be an absolute ban on owning agricultural land unless you meet certain exceptions. And there may be an acreage limitation in some of the states that, such as Iowa, that have more restrictive measures. But ultimately, it's a policy decision to be made by the people of those states. And in those states that have such restrictions, they deemed it important to do so. Other states, maybe the agricultural industry is not that big of an issue there. Maybe there's never been an interest by foreign individuals and entities to acquire ag land in those states. But for whatever reason, they've not deemed it to be an important enough policy situation to come up with any type of restriction.
Typically see this more so in some of the, what we might call the heartland of the country?
Yeah, that's where the big restrictions are at. Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, those are the states that have the most restrictive type provisions in their state laws. Other states, they might have a provision, but it's not going to be as restrictive as Iowa, Missouri, and Minnesota.
And do we expect then the investments to continue? Is that kind of where we're headed?
Well, that's an international economic type issue. If foreigners view investment in agricultural land in the United States as a better investment than what they could invest in elsewhere across the world, then there'll be a greater interest in it, and vice versa. The converse is also true. So that depends on the economics of it. Agriculture in the United States is a pretty good, solid, long-term investment, but again, the concern here is if we potentially have individuals that could be disloyal to the United States, do we want some type of restriction on them owning and holding agricultural land? And the Congress deemed that to be an important enough issue back in 1978 to create that reporting requirement, and a number of states have enacted policies to put some sort of restriction in place. But this is not a new concept. This comes to us all the way from England. People under the English common law, aliens, could not acquire title to land unless the king approved. And that idea carried through early days of the founding of this country and ultimately resulted in that 1978 act by Congress.
That's agricultural law professor Roger McEowen of Washburn University, a regular contributor to Agriculture Today. And while we have just a moment, we'd like to pass along a reminder of an upcoming weed management field day set for July 2nd in Hayes. Here to provide the details is Vipan Kumar, a weed scientist at the Research Center.
We have been planting our beans. We finished planting our soybeans last week and planning on planting our milo as well as some sunflower plots probably this week if it doesn't rain. So, yeah, a lot of planting and putting our pre-applications right now. That's all what we are doing right now.
And these are all part of field trials then?
Yes, these will be all part of the field day. We have been arranging the plots. I'm going to demonstrate some of the treatments we are putting in those row crops: corn, soybean, sunflower, as well as sorghum, grain sorghum. And we will have also some additional studies looking at some simulation drift with the different traits and different herbicides.
In terms of the demonstrations, what exactly can you show the producers?
As you know, or most of the growers know, we have different traits or herbicide-resistant soybean traits right now. We have dicamba-resistant beans as well as 2,4-D-resistant bean, which is going to be commercially available from this year. The demonstration for those studies will emphasize what if grower has a particular trait on their farm, for example, 2,4-D resistant beans or enlist beans, and if there is a drift from dicamba application from the neighbor or neighboring field, so what type of symptoms they can see with those applications or those drift particles from the other fields or the neighboring fields. So it'll be like a vice versa drift simulation of dicamba on enlist soybean as well as conventional soybean as well as 2,4-D drift on other traits. So it'll be like a demonstration of those low rates application of those herbicides.
There is no cost to attend this field day?
There is no cost to attend this field day, but I would like to point out, would encourage the participants to pre-register for the event so that I can estimate how many folks are coming for the event. So there is a pre-registration link in the flyer, or anybody can go online at www.hayes.kstate.edu/programs/weeds/field day, and they can register online also.
And you would really like that because you've also got lunch that day and you need a head count.
Yes, I would appreciate if I can have those head counts and can make those arrangements. And also, I would like to point out for the event, we are offering a CCA as well as commercial applicator CEU credits for the event. So there'll be some opportunity to get those credits as well.
That's Vipan Kumar, a weed scientist at the K-State Research and Extension Agricultural Research Center in Hayes. The annual Weed Management Field Day is set for July 2nd. Agriculture Today is back after the break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. I'm Jeff Wickman. In today's agricultural news, the proposal for USDA's latest round of Market Facilitation Program payments is currently under review, according to a senior Agriculture Department official. Rod Bain reports.
Producers await details of the second round of the Market Facilitation Program, including payment rates. An update where the MFP proposal is currently at was provided Tuesday by USDA Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs, Ted McKinney, before a House Agriculture Subcommittee.
The formula is under review by OMB,
referring to the Federal Office of Management and Budget.
But we have changed how that's calculated, so it's not just a one-year look back, but it's looking back over several years. So we'll have to see what comes out of the OMB where it is currently under review.
The trade mitigation package, including the Market Facilitation Program, will allow USDA to provide up to $16 billion to support producers impacted by trade disruptions. But as Undersecretary McKinney emphasized,
Secretary Perdue, I, and most farmers would much rather have trade than aid. But given the circumstances, we hear that they're grateful and we're working very closely with them.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Well, one of the most competitive fed cattle shows in the country takes place annually in Garden City. Todd Domer with the Kansas Livestock Association takes a look at the owners and statistics from the winning cattle.
While the 110 steers and heifers competing earlier this month at the Beef Empire Days Fed Cattle Show in Garden City may not seem like a large number, the cattle were sorted from millions of head on feed across the High Plains. A 1,462-pound steer fed at Midwest Feeders of Ingalls by JCS GP and Frank Harper was named the overall winner of the show. The Smoky Charlet steer placed 8th live and 5th in the carcass contest, graded middle choice, and was a yield grade 1.56 to earn the Earl C. Brookover Memorial Award for the highest combined finish of any animal in the show. Sunbelt Feed Yard of Hugoton fed the reserve champion overall steer for Dale and Carol Varan. The 1,590-pound black steer won the live show, placed 21st in the carcass division, graded high choice, and was a yield grade 2.58. The grand champion overall heifer was fed at Ersick and Dahl Feed Yard of Garden City by Cimarron Cattle Company. This heifer weighed 1,330 pounds live, was 8th in the live show, 6th in the carcass contest, graded middle choice, and was a yield grade 2.38. A 1,540-pound steer fed at Triangle H of Garden City by Alan Jett was chosen as the grand champion carcass steer. The black steer graded low prime and was a yield grade 1.98. Kinsley Feeders fed and co-owned the champion carcass heifer along with McLaughlin Farms. This black heifer weighed 1,558 pounds live, graded low prime, and was a yield grade 2.04. Wesley Woods owned the champion live heifer, a 1,462-pound Charlet Cross fed at Sunbelt Feed Yard. I'm Todd Domer.
In this week's soybean update, Sean Brotherson from North Dakota State University discusses farmers under stress.
Dr. Sean Brotherson, professor and extension family science specialist at North Dakota State University, joins us. Dr. Brotherson, we've seen farmers go through so much this year that has put a lot of stress on them, which affects their health and well-being. You know, we sometimes forget about the importance of the health and wellness of the farm operator.
As we look at stress and its effects on individuals who are working in agriculture, I think it's really useful to step back and take a little perspective and think about the assets on your farm or ranch operation. Often you'll think about land, equipment, livestock, or crops. I mean, there's different things that you put among your assets. But overall, the most important asset on any farm or ranch operation is actually the health of the farmer or rancher and those working on the farm. And so because it's your most important asset, then it really should be a priority. And it's very important to pay attention to the signals that indicate you're experiencing stress. I liken it to thinking about the signals that pop up on the dashboard of a vehicle that say, hey, you need to pay attention. There's a little bit of stress occurring in your engine, and you need to get specific and find out what's going on. And so you can see physical symptoms that include things like headache or backache, digestive issues, or a lot of fatigue. You You can see some emotional issues with having low mood, irritability, just feeling discouraged or wanting to withdraw from other people. And you may see some things in terms of behavior when you're having difficulty with sleep or trouble making decisions, or find yourself self-medicating with overuse of alcohol or other drugs. So those are things to pay attention to, and then you want to take steps that are going to be helpful in managing your health.
Because it's stress on one person, but if you have a family, that stress can spread out.
Stress tends to reverberate through the family. So you may be feeling financial pressures on your farm or ranch operation, and then that may reverberate into you're having health difficulties, or you're having more challenges communicating with people on your farm operation or members of your family. You'll find yourself trying to work longer and longer hours. That means you have less emotional energy for a spouse or for being a parent, and those relationships are very important. The farm is not more important than the family members on the farm. Family members can be a tremendous support during times of stress.
Dr. Sean Brotherson, professor and extension family science specialist at North Dakota State University, joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
And finally, in agricultural news, the K-State Research and Extension News Media Services team has launched 2 new communication efforts, a weekly blog, Better Kansas, and a monthly podcast, Dig Deep. The Better Kansas blog is written by Mary Lou Peter and is posted each Thursday. The blog highlights the breadth of services offered through K-State Research and Extension through a sampling of programs, resources, and events. The content is meant to be shared, so readers who find something they think family and friends need to see are encouraged to share it via social media. The Dig Deep podcast is a monthly conversation with scientists whose work is funded through K-State Research and Extension. In each episode, Randall Kowalik talks with a different scientist about their work, what spurred their curiosity, what motivates them to keep digging, and what they're like as people. The podcast launched with 2 episodes. One features Cassie Jones, assistant professor of feed technology in the Department of Grain Science and Industry, and the other features Cheryl Boyer, associate professor of nursery crops in the Department of Horticulture and Natural Resources. The podcast is free and can be received automatically on mobile devices through any podcast app. Simply use the search function and type Dig Deep Kansas, then tap the subscribe button. And that's a look at today's agricultural news. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
This is Agriculture Today.
Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
By looking at old photographs, one gets the idea as well as from the early correspondence.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Last Friday, my wife Anneke and I drove the hour drive north to Marysville. I wanted to see how the long day of hard work by the volunteers in the gardens of the Kester House had stood up to the rain. With a few dry, sunny days, I expected that plants would show themselves at their best. I was not disappointed. The effort of the long day's work had been on some basic core plantings and the many interesting old-fashioned containers. The plantings looked good. They had survived the heavy rainfall, which is something not to be said about the low-lying cropland, but more about that later. The volunteers around Kester House had, with the guidance of the landscape designer Laura Stack, done an interesting transformation to the old garden. The present budget only allowed to concentrate on the many varied containers and borderlines. By looking at old photographs, one gets the idea as well as from the early correspondence. A few borderlines were planted, and the colors accentuated the old forms of the garden. Over time, when more can be done, it will be amazing how this historic garden can be restored and brought to life again. This was a great start. My wife had a few comments which were interesting, but it showed me that I was already seeing much more than presently was done. I had studied the garden plan drawings done by Laura and presented at meetings. That is, the future of the historic garden in the spirit of its former owner Charles Kester. Anneke and I briefly stepped inside, and I showed her the interior rooms, all ready for visitors. I loved the library. The host was guiding another couple through the house. I was happy to see their interest. I explained to Anneke that it all had started with a 2-room house Charles had bought and then added on to as his family grew. Stepping outside, along the back, there were the ice house and summer kitchen, the stable. I enjoyed the mass of flowers growing against the foundation. I imagined how I could hear chickens in the small chicken house attached to the building. The upkeep of all is not easy, but once buildings like this, of which you know the people opened and closed doors, are gone, those buildings will never come back with their stories. The fun part is that stories are written up and can be read and shared. The Kester house is a treasure, and I was glad to see that the hard work paid off. The spirit of Charles was there. Before we left, we swung by the Pony Express rider. He was getting out of town fast. Or rather, I should say, his trusted pony was. Looking at the bronze statue, I was glad to see the native grasses and forbs growing at the feet of the pony. Well done. Here in Manhattan, we have a bronze Native American standing on top of ornamental shrubs. It just doesn't fit. Whenever I drive around the roundabout, I'm surprised he's still standing there. One of these days I expect him to walk away, disgusted. If he did, he would probably walk to the edge of the Blue River and look out across the flooded cropland and flooded valleys. I'm sure he would not be surprised, and he would say, "I told you so." It always happens. It is the history of our rivers and streams. The lowlands flood. Driving out of Mearsville, you can see in places the backed-up water of Tuttle Lake. Crossing the bridge on the north end of the lake, it's all water, touching the hills. Here and there, a tall tree sticks its top up above the waves. It's a lot of water. North of Blue Rapids, you cross the river, which has totally gone outside its banks, and has been so for quite a while. When I drove through Waterville, I thought how appropriate a name for a community edged by low-lying fields all flooded. But that's not what the name is for. Apparently the roots of the name are in New York State. Well, be that as it may, looking out across the soaked fields, I thought the name fitted. On the way back, we passed a metal shed again, partly blown over. There must have been a strong wind at one time, flipping the roof. It's not something you want to happen, especially not with machinery inside. Talking about machines, I did pass one huge tractor, pulling a line of attachment. Cultivars folded in, followed by a liquid fertilizer tank on its own wheels. The thought that such a big piece of equipment can be used here must mean that we do have large fields between those rolling hills and pastures. Makes me wonder, why did all those people move to Oregon? Why did they not stay in Kansas? After all, Charles Kester stayed in Kansas, and so did I. We can grow beautiful gardens, and that mighty big equipment tells me we can grow big crops. Right now the lowlands are wet, but it will get better. This is Kansas. To the stars, through difficulties.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas.
And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. This reminder to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, or using an app on your mobile device, type these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. By tapping the subscribe button, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. That's agtoday.net. This is the K-State Radio Network.